Hi, I'm Andrew from Parlogram, and welcome to our review of the film and soundtrack of Paul McCartney, Man on the Run.
Well, 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 well.
By now, quite a few people have already shared their thoughts on this film, but I wanted to wait a bit longer, watch it a couple of times, not just on my own, and think about what it's actually trying to do. When Man on the Run was announced, especially following the recent Wings compilation, I think many people assumed it would be a kind of Wings anthology, a proper album-by-album history of the band. Well, it isn't, and once you realise that, the film makes a lot more sense. It isn't really a history of Wings, it's the story of Paul McCartney after the Beatles and what he did after. If you're expecting detailed coverage of albums like Wildlife, Red Rose Speedway, Venus and Mars or London Town, you may be surprised to find that most of them barely feature at all. The film moves quite quickly between the key albums, songs and lineups, with Band on the Run doing a lot of the heavy lifting. Now for hardcore fans, that can be frustrating, and I understand that, but it does seem to be a deliberate choice. One of the most interesting creative decisions in Man on the Run is that almost nobody appears speaking on camera. Paul doesn't, the members of Wings don't, Sean Ono Lennon is heard but not seen, Linda appears through archive audio, and Mary and Stella are heard but not filmed. Everyone is present but just not visually, and I think that's key to how this film works. Unlike something like Beatles 64, the voices sit over the footage, which keeps everything grounded in the period the film's talking about. Paul told the director Morgan Neville that he didn't want to appear on screen as an old man in a young man's story, and I understand that. His voice works particularly well here. It's older now, of course, but that actually gives it a certain weight, and you get the sense that he's been carrying that weight for a long time. One aspect the film handles very well is Paul's emotional state in the early 1970s. After the Beatles split up, he retreated to his farm in Scotland, grew a beard, and by his own admission, drank a bit too much. At one point, he says he realised it was time to grow up and face a new reality, very different from the life he'd known within the Beatles. But in true McCartney style, he simply gets on with it and starts again, almost from scratch. First with McCartney and Ram, and then with Wings. Telling a story this big inside a feature documentary inevitably means some compression. The first cut reportedly ran to around 3, possibly even 4 hours. What we end up with is a film that runs just under 2. And that creates an odd situation, where the film both feels too long and not long enough. There's a lot of information here, and the film moves quickly. For casual viewers, it can feel a little overwhelming. Watching it again with someone who enjoys the music but isn't steeped in all the details, that was one of the first reactions, that it's quite intense to absorb in a single sitting. But for long-term fans, it's the opposite problem. There simply isn't enough room for certain parts of the story to play out properly. You notice that especially towards the end of the film. After the huge success of Mull of Kintyre, for example, the film suddenly becomes darker and more hurried as events move quickly towards the end of Wings. The Japan episode arrives quite suddenly. Paul even suggests at one point that part of him almost expected to get into trouble there, almost as if things were reaching their natural conclusion. Watching it again, I actually found myself feeling a little sorry for director Morgan Neville. It's quite clear that he wanted to tell a bigger story here, but when you're dealing with a subject as large as Paul McCartney, there are always going to be compromises about what you include and what you leave out. For example, certain members of Wings barely feature. Jeff Britton, for instance. I also felt Denny Laine could perhaps have been given a little more space. There are also moments where a little more context might have helped. Mary Had a Little Lamb, for example, appears almost with disbelief, with Nick Lowe reacting rather colourfully to it. But there's no explanation that the song was written partly in response to the BBC banning Give Ireland Back to the Irish. That said, there's a lot in Man on the Run that works very well. The archive material alone makes the film worth watching. There are home movies, studio recordings, and glimpses of Paul working at home that many fans will have never seen before. For a filmmaker, having access to this kind of material must have been a dream. The near-drowning incident in Hawaii is handled particularly well. It's a story Paul has rarely spoken about before, and the home movie footage from that trip makes it very real. Hearing him describe just how close he came to dying is quite sobering, and it's one of those moments where you realise how easily things might have turned out differently. The way the film deals with John Lennon's death is also handled very well. It's restrained and thoughtful, and it finally puts Paul's famous "it's a drag" comment into proper context. Sean Ono Lennon's reflections are particularly perceptive here, and they help shed a little more light on that moment. The film is directed by Morgan Neville, who previously made 20 Feet from Stardom, the Oscar-winning documentary about backing singers. And I think he's done a good job here. This isn't an easy story to shape, and overall, the film feels well put together. One thing that becomes very clear as the film unfolds is just how central Linda was to Paul's life during this period. In many ways, the film almost becomes a tribute to her. She's there throughout, at home, on the road, and in the band itself. Alongside the film, which is now available to stream on Amazon Prime, there's also this soundtrack album. The inner sleeve actually describes it as a snapshot, which I think is quite a good way of looking at it. It isn't meant to be a complete Wings anthology. If you're looking for that, you're better off getting something like this. There are a few interesting things here, although personally I would have probably liked to see a more detailed 2-disc set, perhaps with a few more rarities. But as a souvenir of the film, the idea of a snapshot does make sense. My copy of the soundtrack is on black vinyl and pressed by Optimal in Germany, and I must say it's a fine sounding and flawless pressing. I also like the way the design incorporates the vintage turquoise and purple colours of the old Capitol labels. Overall, the sound is excellent. Of course, the Silly Love Songs demo is demo quality, and Gotta Sing, Gotta Dance clearly comes from the soundtrack of the television special, but everything else sounds first class. There are several versions available. Amazon has an exclusive tangerine peel orange pressing, as well as CDs and download editions. There's also a limited edition Third Man Records pressing on New York Taxi yellow vinyl, which at the time of recording is back in stock at paulmccartney.com. Links to all of those are in the description. I think part of the reaction to this film is shaped by what Peter Jackson did with Get Back, and by the recently restored Beatles anthology. Those projects raised expectations. People now often hope for that kind of total immersion, but not every story needs to be told on that scale. The John Lennon 1:1 film, for example, focuses on a much shorter period of just 2 or 3 years, and it works very well because of that. Man on the Run clearly isn't aimed at people who already know every twist and turn of the Wings story. It feels like it's more designed for people who've come to the Beatles more recently and are beginning to explore what Paul did afterwards. And as an introduction to his 1970s story, it actually works very well. When you try and tell a story as big as Paul McCartney in the 1970s within the limits of a feature film, there are always going to be compromises. A 2-hour documentary is still the standard format for projects like this, because it's easier to present as a single release. But in some ways, the material here feels larger than the format, especially since the film only had a 1-day cinema release before moving to streaming. In that sense, a short series of perhaps 4 or 5 episodes might have actually suited the story better and allowed it to breathe a little more. For general audiences, I think Man on the Run works very well. For hardcore fans, it will probably never feel quite long enough. What it really leaves you hoping is that the next chapter of Paul McCartney's story, the years after 1980, might one day receive the same treatment. There's certainly no shortage of stories to tell. Let me know in the comments what you made of the film, especially if you're a Wings fan. I promise I do read every single comment on this channel. I'll be back next weekend with something else. But that's all for this one, so I'll say bye for now and thanks for watching.